I've always loved train travel. There's something calming about the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks and the fleeting views of the countryside. But after my experience last winter, I don't think I'll ever set foot on a train again. I was traveling from Chicago to Denver, visiting my sister for the holidays. It was a long ride, but I'd opted for the night train, thinking I'd sleep through most of it. The station was bustling when I boarded, though by the time we pulled out, only a handful of passengers remained in my car. The first few hours were uneventful. I read for a while, watched the moonlight flicker through the windows, and eventually drifted off. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to an unusual quiet. The train was still moving, but the comforting murmur of fellow passengers was gone. My car was empty. I sat up, confused. The ticket inspector hadn't mentioned anything about transferring cars. I peered out into the corridor. It stretched endlessly in both directions, dimly lit and eerily still. That's when I noticed the door to the next car sliding open. A man stepped through, dressed in an outdated conductor's uniform. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his cap, but his stance was stiff, almost mechanical. He walked slowly toward me, his polished shoes clicking on the floor. "Ticket, please," he said, his voice low and hollow. I handed him my ticket without a second thought. He examined it, his head tilting slightly, then handed it back. "This car is closed. You need to move forward." "Closed? Why?" He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the door behind him. His hand was thin and pale, the veins beneath his skin dark and prominent. Reluctantly, I gathered my things and followed him. As soon as I stepped into the next car, the door slid shut behind me with a metallic clang. This car was different. The windows were frosted over, and the air was noticeably colder. The seats were worn, their upholstery frayed. An acrid smell lingered in the air, faint but unpleasant. There were people here, or at least I thought there were. They sat silently, their faces turned toward the windows. None of them acknowledged me, not even when I walked down the aisle. Something about their stillness made my skin crawl. The conductor appeared again, standing at the far end of the car. He pointed to the next door. "Keep moving." My heart raced as I obeyed. Each car I passed through was stranger than the last. The passengers were increasingly unnatural, some with faces obscured by shadows, others with features that seemed wrong. Eyes too large, smiles too wide. Finally, I reached a car that was completely empty. The seats were gone, replaced by wooden benches. The walls were bare, the windows non-existent, and the air, oh God, the air, was suffocating. It carried a metallic tang that stung my throat. "Why am I here?" I demanded, spinning around, but the conductor was gone. Panic set in as I searched for an exit, any exit, but the car seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The light overhead flickered, plunging the space into intermittent darkness. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, rising and falling like the wind. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Turn back," it murmured. "Turn back before it's too late." My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the next door. As I reached for the handle, it flew open, slamming against the wall. Beyond was a void. Not darkness. Darkness implies something tangible. This was nothingness, a gaping maw that seemed to swallow all light and sound. And yet, deep within that void, I sensed something watching me. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut. But when I turned around, the car was no longer empty. The passengers had returned, though they were no longer human. Their bodies twisted and writhed, their limbs bending at impossible angles. Their eyes, glassy and void of life, were fixed on me. The whisper grew louder, now a cacophony of voices. "Turn back, turn back, turn back." I bolted, running through car after car, each one more grotesque than the last. The walls dripped with a black, tar-like substance. The floor seemed to pulse beneath my feet. And the passengers, God, the passengers. They reached for me with skeletal hands, their mouths stretched in silent screams. Finally, I burst into a car that was bright and warm, the familiar chatter of normal passengers filling the air. I collapsed into a seat, gasping for breath. No one seemed to notice my disheveled state. The train was exactly as it had been when I first boarded. But when I looked at my ticket, my stomach dropped. The date was wrong. Not by a day or two, but by years. According to the ticket, I'd boarded the train in 1953. When I arrived in Denver, I tried to explain what had happened to the station staff, but they brushed me off. The Midnight Express doesn't run anymore, one of them said. Hasn't for decades. Too many incidents. I never found out what really happened that night. But every so often, I dream of that void, of the whispers that warned me to turn back. And when I wake, I can still feel the icy grip of skeletal hands on my arm. I've been a commuter for years, riding the same train line every day to and from work. It's a mundane routine, one that rarely changes. But a few months ago, something happened that still keeps me awake at night. It was a Friday evening, and I'd stayed late at the office. By the time I got to the station, the platform was nearly deserted. The last train of the night rolled in, its brakes screeching like nails on a chalkboard. I stepped into an empty car and found a seat near the window. As the train pulled out of the station, I settled in, watching the dark landscape blur past. It was quiet, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the old car. About 20 minutes in, the train began to slow. I glanced at my watch. We weren't scheduled for another stop yet. Curious, I looked out the window and saw we were pulling into a station I didn't recognize. The platform was dimly lit, the signage worn and unreadable. A dense fog hung in the air, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The doors hissed open, but no one got on. At least, not at first. Then I saw her. A woman in a long black coat stepped out of the fog, her movements slow and deliberate. She had long, dark hair that obscured her face, and she carried a small suitcase. She stepped onto the train, the door sliding shut behind her. She didn't look at me as she walked past, heading for a seat at the far end of the car. Something about her presence felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but my instinct screamed that I shouldn't be there. The train started moving again, but the usual hum was gone, replaced by a low, guttural groan. The lights overhead flickered, casting erratic shadows across the car. I glanced back at the woman. She was sitting perfectly still, her suitcase on the seat beside her. But her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if she were listening for something. I tried to ignore her, focusing instead on my phone. But when I checked for the time, there was no signal, no Wi-Fi, nothing. The train slowed again, this time coming to a stop in the middle of nowhere. There was no platform, no lights, just an expanse of empty fields. What's going on? I muttered to myself. The woman stood, her movements fluid and almost too graceful. She picked up her suitcase and turned toward me. For the first time, I saw her face. Her eyes were wrong. They weren't just dark. They were voids, endless pits that seemed to pull the light from the room. Her mouth twisted into a smile that stretched far too wide, revealing teeth that were unnaturally sharp. I froze, unable to look away as she began to walk toward me. Her footsteps were silent, despite the worn metal floor. "Do you know where this train goes?" she asked, her voice soft and melodic, yet somehow filled with malice. "And no," I stammered, my throat dry. Her smile widened. "Not many do." Before I could react, the lights flickered off completely, plunging the car into darkness. The train lurched forward, its speed increasing at an alarming rate. I gripped the edge of my seat, my heart pounding as the car shook violently. When the lights flickered back on, she was gone. I looked around frantically, but there was no sign of her. The car was empty, and her suitcase was nowhere to be seen. The train screeched to a stop, throwing me forward. I scrambled to my feet, looking out the window. We were at another station. But this one was even stranger than the last. The platform was cracked and overgrown with weeds, and the air was heavy with the stench of decay. The sign above read, "The last stop." I hesitated, unsure of what to do. The train wasn't moving, and the silence was oppressive. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw her again. She was standing on the platform, her back to me, staring into the fog. I don't know why I did it, but I called out to her. "Who are you?" She turned her head just slightly, enough for me to see the corner of that grotesque smile. "You're not supposed to be here," she said. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, the platform was empty. The train jerked forward, speeding away from the station. I sank into my seat, my hands shaking. When I finally arrived at my destination, I stumbled off the train, desperate for fresh air. I tried to tell the station attendant about the strange stops and the woman, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. "There's no station called The Last Stop," he said firmly. "I've taken the bus ever since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of a train whistle, long and mournful. And I wonder if the woman is still out there, waiting for the next unfortunate passenger to board her train." It was supposed to be a quick ride home. I'd worked late and caught the last train out of the city, heading toward the sleepy little suburb where I lived. By then, the cars were almost empty, the other passengers either dozing off or scrolling mindlessly on their phones. I found a seat near the back of the car, hoping to get some quiet. The train lurched forward, and I settled in, the faint hum of the engine lulling me into a sense of calm. About 10 minutes in, the car lights flickered. It wasn't unusual. This train line was notorious for its old, poorly maintained equipment. But then, something strange happened. When the lights stabilized, I realized there was someone sitting across from me who hadn't been there before. She was a young woman, maybe in her 20s, with long blonde hair that fell in messy waves. Her clothes were outdated, an old-fashioned dress that looked like something from the 1950s. But what struck me most was her expression. She looked lost. Her wide eyes darted around the car as if she was searching for something or someone. I tried to ignore her, assuming she was just another eccentric commuter. But then she spoke, her voice soft and tremulous. "Do you know where this train is going?" I hesitated. To the suburbs? Are you okay?" She frowned, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "I thought I was going somewhere else." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something off about her. Her presence felt wrong, like she didn't quite belong. The train passed through a tunnel, and the lights flickered again. For a brief moment, everything went dark. When the lights returned, the woman was gone. I looked around, confused. There was no way she could have left. The train hadn't stopped, and the doors hadn't opened. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired. Maybe I'd imagined her. But then, as we pulled into the next station, I saw her again. She was standing on the platform, staring directly at me through the window. Her lips moved, though I couldn't hear the words. The doors opened, but she didn't get on. She just stood there, her eyes locked on mine. The train pulled away, leaving her behind. I exhaled, relieved, but my heart was still racing. And then I saw her again. She was back in the car, sitting in the same seat across from me. I froze, my stomach knotting with dread. She hadn't boarded the train. There was no way she could have. She looked at me again, her expression unreadable. "Do you know where this train is going?" she asked, her voice exactly the same as before. My mouth was dry, but I managed to stammer out a reply. I already told you. To the suburbs." She tilted her head slightly, studying me. "Are you sure?" The train began to slow, and I realized we were pulling into another station. But this one was unfamiliar. The platform was dimly lit, and the station sign was missing. The air outside was thick with fog, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The woman stood and walked toward the door. "This is my stop," she said softly. The doors slid open, and she stepped out. But as she disappeared into the fog, I noticed something chilling. The other passengers in the car were gone. The doors closed, and the train began moving again. I stood up, looking around frantically. The car was completely empty. I moved to the next car, hoping to find someone, anyone, but it was empty too. Each car I passed through was the same, silent, desolate, and utterly devoid of life. My panic grew as I realized I was alone. Alone, except for her. I turned to see her standing at the far end of the car, her face partially obscured by her hair. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed at me. The lights flickered, and when they came back on, she was inches away from me. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. The train lurched, and I stumbled backward. When I looked up, she was gone again. Finally, the train came to a stop. I bolted out of the car, desperate to get away. But when I looked around, I realized I wasn't at my usual station. I wasn't even sure I was at a station at all. The platform was empty, the air thick with an unnatural chill. A single sign hung above, its letters faded and nearly illegible. End of the line. I turned back toward the train, but it was already pulling away. The lights from the car windows flickered as it disappeared into the darkness, leaving me stranded. I haven't taken the train since. I drive everywhere now, even if it's inconvenient. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the distant rumble of a train, and every time, I feel a pair of hollow eyes watching me from the shadows. The commuter train I take to work runs like clockwork. Same schedule, same stops, same faces every morning. That's why it struck me as odd when, last month, I saw a new conductor on board. He wasn't like the others. Instead of the usual crisp uniform and friendly demeanor, this man looked disheveled. His uniform was worn and slightly faded, and his face was gaunt, his skin almost gray. But it was his eyes that unnerved me the most, dark, sunken, and brimming with something I can only describe as desperation. I first noticed him as we pulled out of the station. He stood at the front of the car, gripping the overhead rail with one skeletal hand, his gaze sweeping over the passengers. When he reached me, his eyes locked onto mine. It wasn't just a glance. It was a stare, intense and piercing. I tried to look away, but I felt rooted to the spot, like his gaze had pinned me in place. "Ticket," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I handed it over, trying to ignore the icy chill that crept over me as his fingers brushed mine. He examined the ticket for an unusually long time before handing it back. "You need to get off," he murmured. "What?" I asked, startled. "This train isn't safe for you. Get off at the next stop." I laughed nervously, assuming he was joking. "I take this train every day. What are you talking about?" His expression didn't change. "This is your only warning." Before I could ask him what he meant, he turned and walked to the next passenger. The rest of the ride was uneventful, but his words stayed with me. When we reached my stop, I half expected something terrible to happen, but everything seemed normal. I brushed it off as a weird encounter and went about my day. But the next morning, he was there again. And the morning after that. Every day, he gave me the same warning. "This train isn't safe for you. Get off." By the end of the week, I was starting to lose sleep over it. Something about his tone, his eyes, made it impossible to dismiss him. I even considered changing my route, but that would have added hours to my commute. Then, one Friday, as we approached my usual stop, he appeared beside me. I hadn't even seen him enter the car. "Get off now," he said, his voice sharper than before. Something in his tone sent a jolt of fear through me. Without thinking, I grabbed my bag and hurried to the door. As soon as I stepped onto the platform, the train pulled away, faster than usual. And then I saw it. A few hundred yards down the track, another train barreled toward us, speeding in the wrong direction. The collision was instant and catastrophic. Metal screeched against metal as both trains crumpled like paper. The impact sent cars flying off the tracks, shattering glass and sparking fires. My knees buckled as I watched in horror. Passengers screamed, their cries muffled by the deafening noise of the wreckage. If I'd stayed on the train, I staggered back, my heart pounding. Emergency crews arrived within minutes, but it was clear the devastation was massive. I overheard one of the responders mention fatalities, and my stomach twisted. I couldn't bring myself to go home. Instead, I sat on a bench at the station, staring at the wreckage, trying to process what had just happened. Hours later, as the sun began to set, I noticed something strange. Among the chaos of responders and onlookers, I saw the conductor, the same one who'd warned me. He was standing near the edge of the platform, watching me. But this time, he looked different. His uniform was pristine, his face fuller, his eyes calm. He gave me a small nod, almost as if to say, "I told you." And then he turned and walked toward the tracks. I blinked, and he was gone. In the weeks that followed, I scoured the news for any mention of him. I even contacted the train company, asking about the conductor on that route. They told me no one matching his description worked there. To this day, I don't know who or what he was. But every time I board a train, I can't help but look around, half expecting to see him again. And if I do, I swear I'll listen. I work as a railway maintenance technician, a job that mostly involves inspecting tracks and ensuring everything runs smoothly. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work, and I've always enjoyed the solitude of the late-night shifts. Until one night, about 6 months ago, when I stumbled upon something I can't explain. That night, I was tasked with inspecting a rarely used line on the outskirts of town. The track ran through a forested area, and the isolation was palpable. It was the kind of place where the sound of your own footsteps seemed louder than usual. Around midnight, as I walked the line, I spotted something unusual up ahead. There was a train car sitting on the tracks, a single, rusty car, disconnected from any engine or other cars. This was strange for several reasons. First, this line wasn't active, and no trains were scheduled to run on it. Second, the car looked ancient, like it hadn't been moved in decades. Its paint was faded, the windows were grimy, and the metal frame was covered in rust. Curious, I approached it cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The car's door was slightly ajar, creaking as the wind pushed it back and forth. Against my better judgment, I decided to step inside. The interior was dimly lit by a flickering overhead bulb, its light casting eerie shadows on the walls. The seats were old and tattered, their upholstery stained and torn. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic. As I walked down the aisle, I noticed strange marks on the walls and floor. Scratches like someone, or something, had clawed at the surfaces. Then I saw the suitcase. It was sitting in one of the seats, pristine and out of place in the otherwise decrepit car. Unlike everything else, it looked new, its leather exterior shining faintly in the dim light. I reached out to touch it, but before I could, I heard it, a faint whisper. It was so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again, a single word, spoken in a voice that sounded both close and far away, "Don't." I froze, my hand hovering inches above the suitcase. My heart pounded as the whisper repeated, louder this time, "Don't." I snatched my hand back, stumbling away from the seat. That's when I noticed the air around me had changed. It was colder now, and my breath fogged in front of me. The whisper grew louder, joined by others. They overlapped, a cacophony of voices, all repeating the same word, "Don't." I turned to leave, but the aisle seemed longer than before. The door at the far end of the car felt impossibly distant, and the flickering light overhead grew dimmer with each step I took. Then I saw them. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, their shapes barely discernible in the faint light. They were humanoid but wrong, too tall. their limbs elongated, their faces featureless. They moved slowly, almost gliding, their heads tilted as if studying me. The whispers grew deafening, and I realized they weren't just saying don't. They were saying something else, something I couldn't quite make out. Panic set in. I broke into a run, the aisle stretching endlessly before me. The figures followed, their movements smooth and eerily silent. Finally, I reached the door and threw it open. I stumbled out onto the tracks, gasping for air, and turned around. The car was gone. I stood there, my flashlight shaking in my hand, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The tracks were empty, the forest silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next day, but he didn't believe me. He said the line had been abandoned for years and that no train, or train car, had been on it in decades. But I know what I saw. Sometimes, when I work late shifts, I think about that car, about the suitcase and the whispers, about the figures that seemed to materialize out of the shadows. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd opened the suitcase.